So today we're going to talk about global mass extinction events and climate change. And so just like death is inevitable, the end of your life, humans, we die, living organisms eventually die. The inevitable fate of all species is to eventually go extinct. The fossil record tells us that over 99.9% of all life on Earth that has ever existed has gone extinct. And one day, our species will either succumb to this fate or we will evolve into something else also. So extinction can occur in two ways. We can have what's called an evolutionary dead end, such as the trilobites. They were a really diverse group of marine animals, and all of them went extinct. So there's no longer any living relatives of them. Or it could be like the dinosaurs, whereas there's no longer dinosaurs, but a certain group of them evolved into modern day birds. So evolution can end a species as well. The typical lifespan of a species on average is 1 to 4 million years. But there's some, like cinnamon ferns and horseshoe crabs, that have been around for over 190 million years, unchanged. And so extinction's been can be gradual or sudden. And throughout Earth's history, there have been at least 5 different times when there was a big sudden change. Most biologists, conservation ecologists, geologists would argue that we're currently in a 6th mass extinction event that is caused by human activity. So let's look at these. So we're going to talk about those 5 previous events, what our current extinction rate is, and then how global climate change ties into that, and what are the causes of global climate change and all that. Okay, so in the past, we've had 5 mass extinction events seen here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're currently in number 6, but we'll get to that in a minute. And so these mass extinctions can be caused by genetic drift, or they can be caused by events that just kill all the species, right? So we've probably all heard about the dinosaurs going extinct, right? We've heard about dinosaurs, maybe played with dinosaur figurines as a kid, and so this happened here. 65 million years ago, that's when dinosaurs went extinct. But there have been 4 other events. The biggest, I guess we'll say, the biggest event was here in the Permian, right here, where 90% of all species died out, right here. So it was a pretty big deal. All of these past mass extinction events have taken place over the span of a few million years. So it's taken, in the geologic time scale, 1 million to 2 million years is nothing, because the age of the Earth is 4.5 billion years old. But to a human and to us, the ecological time scale, 1 million years is a long time. And so if we look at the background rate of extinction, barring these 5 major events, we can see that it's pretty low. It's only about 1 out of every million species that goes extinct each year. But then if we look here, starting about the Industrial Revolution, humans start becoming more populous. We start being able to have more stuff and live in bigger cities, and this is our current extinction rate. And these background rates, they're going to be caused by natural selection. The species wasn't able to cope with its environment as well as its competition, and so it's going to lose out. But these mass extinction events, they could have been caused, were caused by other things. And we are currently causing a mass extinction event by human activity. So if we go back to the dinosaurs, like what killed the dinosaurs? Well, there's a tremendous amount of evidence for what's called the impact hypothesis. And this was that a big giant asteroid struck Earth about 65 million years ago that resulted in the extinction of 60 to 80% of all multicellular species. So it's plants, it's animals, it's everything multicellular. 60 to 80% of them died. That's a pretty big deal. How do we know it was a asteroid? Well, if we look at this time period, so this would be the geologic scale. So if we were drilling down through rock, and around the world, be it in Africa or Europe or North America, at about what's called the KP line, at about this Cretaceous Paleogene boundary here, 65 million years ago, we see a huge spike in this element called iridium. And iridium's pretty rare on Earth, but a lot of meteorites have a bunch of it. So that's one good clue. Another clue is that we have a lot of shock quartz and microtektites, these things here. These are only formed by meteors. They're the only thing with enough power to cause this in nature. And so if we look around the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, we see lots of shock quartz, lots of microtektites, indicating a big meteor impact happened there. And then we have a crater. If we look here at the crater, we can look under the ocean, and the topography shows that there's a big crater. So all of this points to what's called the impact hypothesis. And around the world, there's a line at this KP line, at 65 million years ago, there's a sedimentary rock layer that has a lot of iridium all around the world. So it's a lot of evidence that this is what happened. So that was what did the dinosaurs in, giant asteroid. It's what might do us in, but I suspect we'll kill ourselves off before that happens. The Permian extinction, this was the biggest one. This killed the most species out of the 5. Almost everything went extinct. So 90% of all species went extinct at this one. So what happened? Well, we're not really sure. It's longer ago. There's less rocks still around that are that age, because rocks get recycled. If you take a geology class, you'll learn about that. But over time, the Earth's crust recycles itself. So the older you go, the less rocks there are, because they've been remelted by the mantle. But there's 4 hypotheses for what did the Permian extinction. The first being what's called the Siberian traps, and that's these volcanoes that were kind of like Hawaiian volcanoes. They were basaltic, so they had these big lava flows that erupted for a long time, and it's thought that they added enormous quantities of heat, carbon dioxide, and sulfur dioxide to the atmosphere, which led to an intense global warming. So everything got really hot, and it formed toxic sulfuric acid in the atmosphere. So that's kind of the big hypothesis. Another one is that somehow the oceans became hypoxic, because at this time almost all life was in the oceans. So it's thought they became hypoxic, and everything, without oxygen, stuff that has to breathe dies. Another is that sea levels dropped tremendously. So when the sea levels dropped, there was less space for the things the aquatic organisms to live, and so there's less habitat available, so they died. Another is that there were low oxygen concentrations, and we had high CO2 levels in the atmosphere, and this restricted terrestrial animals to small patches at low elevation habitats. So most all of the life forms on land died. That's another. And then in central Pangaea, because at this time, this is when all the continents are stuck together in the big supercontinent we call Pangaea, all the land masses were stuck. There was a giant central desert, and so it's thought that these deserts could have decreased available habitat, and the desert expanded, and then stuff died. So that's our hypotheses for what happened then. We're not really sure. And it's not settled, and it's primarily because it's older. It happened longer ago, and so there's less. The longer we go back in history, the fewer clues that we have available just because there's fewer rocks of that age still around. And so if we look at the current rate, so how much extinction is happening now? And so there's an inconsistency between the number of species that go extinct and the ability to list their species names within a given time frame. And this is because many species go extinct, and so why do you think we might have thousands of species going extinct and we can only name a few of them? We can't tell you which ones went extinct and where. Think about that for a moment to yourself there. Well, here's why. We got a lot of reasons. So if we have a big conspicuous organism, we're usually pretty sure if it's extinct or not, because they're big and you can see them, and a lot of people know what they are, and that kind of thing. But even with that, these following species here, there's a few discrepancies. So the ivory-billed woodpecker. This woodpecker is thought to be extinct, and it lived in swamps of the coastal plain in North America, and it's huge. It's similar to a pileated woodpecker. They were relatives, but it was much bigger. Had a really long beak, and it was hunted back in the day, both for meat and food and for its feathers, because it had really pretty feathers. And so we shot them all. And then the ones that remained, we destroyed a lot of their habitat, converting it to farmlands and to housing developments and stuff. And so they're thought to be extinct. But a few years ago, someone with some credibility claimed to have seen one in a swamp in Arkansas, but that's yet to be confirmed. So they're probably extinct. But there's a few people that believe that they've seen them. The Australian night parrot was thought to be extinct for many years, but then in 1979 they rediscovered a few, but it's declining, and so it's endangered. It's been declared endangered. There's not very many of them, but there are a few. It was thought to be extinct and was rediscovered. These things are cool. Coelacanths. Coelacanths are really primitive fish. So they're kind of similar to the first fish that had bones. And so they were thought to have went extinct with the dinosaurs. So we got fossil records of coelacanths, and biologists and paleontologists knew about them from fossils, but no one had ever seen one. And then in 1939, they found one alive. A fisherman caught it and was like, "What the heck is this thing?" And so now they're still uncommon and rare and not seen very often, but they exist. And so they're not extinct. Another thing is the Yangtze river dolphin. These haven't been officially declared extinct, but no one's seen any since 2006. And partly why these may not be declared extinct might be political reasons. Like if you're in a government that is controlled by the state, and the media is controlled by the government, it may affect how things get portrayed. But the Yangtze river dolphins have not been declared extinct, but they probably are. No one's seen one in over a decade. And so sadly, many species that may have existed have gone extinct before we even knew about it, because biologists can't be everywhere. And so there's many species out there yet to be discovered. We talked about that in the biodiversity chapter and that sort of thing. And so there's this idea called a centennial extinction. And so what is this? A centennial extinction is when species go extinct before scientists discover them. And the reason that it's called this is a sad story. So in the 1970s in Ecuador, there was a small ridge that some biologists went to, and they documented and discovered 90 species that were unknown to science on this one ridge, just a few square miles. And so they're like, wow, there's a whole lot of stuff there, but these biologists didn't go back to revisit that ridge until the 1980s, at which point the rainforest had been cut down and had been converted to farmland, pasture for cattle, and all 90 of those newly described species had gone extinct, because they were endemic to that small ridge. And so that was in Centinela. It's a small ridge in Ecuador. And so now we use this term Centinela extinctions. And this happens a lot in the tropics around the world because they're places that are often, hostile, they're at war, they're hard to get to. And so there's not a lot of scientists able to go in there and document species. And there's a lot of conversion of forest into farmland and logging the forest just for the timber. And so a lot of things go extinct and we never even knew about it. So why do we even care if something goes extinct? So what? It's kind of like I hate mosquitoes. When they bite me, I don't like it. So if mosquitoes go extinct, why does that matter? Well, it could still matter, right? Even though I don't like them, maybe they have a right to exist, right? Maybe they're food for bats, and bats are cool. So I mean, there's lots of reasons why we should worry about it. And at our current point in geologic history, where humans here exist, why should we care since it's natural? Well, we estimate that one species per million goes extinct naturally without human interference every year. So 1 in a million, just randomly due to natural selection, goes extinct. If we look at what we cause, it's over 27,000 species a year go extinct because of us. So it's like a whole lot more, right? It's hundreds, if not thousands of times higher than the background extinction rate that's caused by us, right? We're humans. We're supposed to be thinking organisms, and we are a tapestry of nature, right? We're part of nature. We sometimes think we're above it and try to control it and whatever. But the reality is we need ecosystems to survive. We can't support ourselves without ecosystems. And so, since we're part of nature and we're causing these extinctions, this is a natural process. Some people have asked that question. And there's a small argument for that, right? Because we're part of nature. We're in the geologic history of the world. We're just another part of that. But I would take it a step further and say that, well, those other 5 mass extinctions weren't caused by a single species. They were caused by geologic events. And B, if we're sentient, thinking beings, we should know better than to be causing this. And so we should try to curb it. Okay, so one cause of these extinctions is climate change. And this is something, we hear this term a lot. So what's it mean? Well, what have you heard? Just think to yourself there, like the term climate change, does that elicit some kind of response to you? Have you heard those words before? Perhaps you've watched documentaries or read books that either explain or try to discredit climate change. For instance, An Inconvenient Truth is a documentary by former Vice President Al Gore that explains the impacts of climate change. Maybe you've seen this. So what do we see? So we got Inconvenient Truth. Michael Crichton wrote the book A State of Fear, and it's about environmental terrorists using global warming to push their agenda. And unfortunately, sometimes politicians use this to justify their inaction. Maybe the media perpetuates falsehoods, right? So the media makes money by selling magazines or selling newspapers or selling ad time on TV. So it's in their, they are an avenue for us to learn stuff about the world for sure, and they're needed. But they also are in the business of selling you information, and so they'll often embellish things or perpetuate falsehoods to make headlines. For example, in the 70s, it was colder than it had been the previous couple decades, and the media, use that to be like, oh, there's a coming ice age, and to get to sell magazines, right? And at the time, scientists weren't saying that. They weren't saying there's going to be an ice age. Climate scientists were like, no, no, that's global warming. We're getting warmer. It's not going to be cold. But since we had a couple big snows in the 70s, like 77 and 78 were particularly snowy winters here in the eastern U.S. And so they grabbed that to sell these headlines and to sell magazines. Then later, in 2008, we used a scary sensationalist language to emotionally motivate people, right? You should be very worried, very worried. We reach the tipping point, and these sorts of things, which, I mean, there's some truth to, because global warming is happening. It is going to change the world. And they've got the picture of a polar bear there because, everybody likes the polar bear. So by it struggling to survive, it's like a symbolism. But the problem with this is that, have you ever seen a real polar bear? Maybe in a zoo. I've seen them in zoos a couple times. I've never seen a real one in the wild. Maybe you have, but probably not. The average person has never in their lives seen a real polar bear. So the fact that, it's a polar bear, we can't relate to it as well. So it makes it difficult for us to relate to and care about the issues of climate change. Right? So we got these polar bears. They're on their last little chunk of ice, and they're probably going to starve to death. But, yeah, never seen one. I don't know what polar bears do. Do you know they eat seals? Maybe, maybe not. So it doesn't have quite the same effect. And then we got political cartoons, right? That perpetuate the effects of climate change as being extreme and super gonna just destroy everything, or is not existing at all and just being non-existent, right? So like this one here. So we've got these kind of opposite ways that cartoons can portray things, but the reality is climate change is happening. The Earth is warming for the most part. There are some places that it's cooling and going to get cooler. This is true. But unanimously, climate scientists agree that things are changing and it's going to happen. And it's because of what's called anthropogenic causes. So humans are causing it. And we'll look at how and why here. And so this idea of saying it's cold outside, global warming's not happening, climate change is a lie. It's a common saying. People say in winter all the time. They're like, oh, it's so cold and all that. Like in 2014, we had the polar vortex. It came down into Kentucky, and it got really cold, and it was like super cold, and hadn't been that cold in a while. And it was like, oh, see, climate change didn't happen. But the reality is that polar vortex was caused by shifting jet streams, which was caused by warmer waters up north, causing us to get Canadian weather in the winter. So it was still caused by climate change. It just happened to make the winter colder at that point. So if we look here at the polar vortex, right, we're like, it's super cold. And everybody's like, it's cold. Climate change isn't happening. But the fact that it came down here was caused by climate change. Okay. So what's the difference in weather versus climate? That's really important when talking about global climate change. You got to know what climate is. So first of all, weather is going to be short-term, day-to-day, hour-to-hour changes in temperature, precipitation, atmospheric pressure, those sorts of things. So that's what weather is. Climate is long-term. You're in it for the long haul. It's longer. And so it usually is decades long, but it's at least long-term. Trends in temperature, precipitation, atmospheric pressure, for a place, be that locally, regionally, or globally. So it's like, what is the long-term trend that this goes through, right? So like this cartoon showing weather, I've seen it for every state I've ever lived in. But you've got Arizona, it's hot and dry. You got Wisconsin, it gets cold up there. Washington State, it rains all the time. Nebraska is windy as crap. And then it's like the weather in Kentucky. The same Thursday, it does all this, right? I've seen that. The weather in Oklahoma, the weather in anywhere with a continental climate has large shifts in weather like this. But you can't base climate on this one day of weather, right? Like we know Arizona's hot and dry. There's it's a desert for the most part. We know Wisconsin gets cold in the winter, and yeah, it does rain a lot in Washington. They got rainforests out there. They get over 100 inches of rain a year, and so these stereotype generalizations of the weather are based on climate. Um, but we got to understand that there can be slight variations in weather, and the climate will still be changing differently, right? So if we take a short-term look, right, we use these hasty generalizations, and this happens all the time in the winter. It's colder than it's ever been. It's climate, global warming is not happening. It's too cold outside. Well, yeah, it can be really super cold that day. The weather, perhaps it's just cold. But if we look at the long-term trend in global average temperatures, or even average temperatures for this place, this could be, say, Kentucky, it's going to be increasing, right? So we get this long-term increase. So you can't base your conclusions on a tiny sample size. You got to look at the whole picture. And so a good way of thinking about the difference in climate and weather is to think of weather as like your mood and climate as like your personality, right? So these are going to be different. Okay. So now that we've established our climate changes, what are the causes? Well, if you live in the northern hemisphere, we're getting ready to go into our fall season. So, it's still hot outside, still summer, but it's going to start cooling off a little. Go into fall, and then we're going to have winter. And this is all caused by the way the earth is tilted. So our seasons, what is a season? Well, a season's going to be, the 4 seasons: spring, summer, winter, fall. Not in that order, but the 4 seasons, right? And so there are these regular annual fluctuations in both temperature, precipitation, and they're caused by the Earth being tilted. So the Earth isn't straight up and down would be this line here, but it's not. It's crooked, 23.5 degrees. So in our summertime, on summer solstice, the northern hemisphere is pointing more towards the sun. So then we come around, getting close to here to fall. And then we come to the winter solstice. Now the northern hemisphere is pointed away from the sun as far as it's going to go. And so we get less sunshine hitting, less hours of daylight, less amounts of radiation. So it makes it, we have these changes in season. So without that, we would have no seasons. There wouldn't be, without the tilt, we wouldn't experience seasons. This other thing that is, talked about, called the Milankovitch cycles. Milankovitch cycles have to do with how wide the Earth's orbit is around the sun, and they change over time, causing climate change. Do we get closer to the sun or farther away from the sun, or closer or farther away? And this is true. These do cause climate change, and they have happened, but actually we're currently in a Milankovitch cycle that would indicate we should be cooling down. We're getting farther away from the sun, but in fact we're getting hotter. So we can't use Milankovitch cycles as the cause of climate change currently. Another thing that is a natural cause of climate change is volcanism. Volcanoes spit out a lot of greenhouse gases. A lot of that stuff coming out of them is potent. There's like methane and sulfur and carbon dioxide and all this stuff spewing out of volcanoes. And so this increased volcanic activity will increase greenhouse gas concentrations, thereby warming the planet. And a decrease in volcanic activity will cool the planet. So this is something else that can happen, right? So if we're talking about greenhouse gases, like what does that even mean? What's a greenhouse gas? What's the greenhouse effect? And well, that's this idea here. So the main cause of global climate change is the greenhouse effect. And so the greenhouse effect is actually really a good thing, because without it, we would all freeze to death at night. It's caused by our atmosphere. And if we were on a planet, say like Mars, that doesn't have an atmosphere, when the sun was pointing at the planet, it might be 150, 200. I forgot the numbers exactly. It's the data is out there on what Mars's actual temperatures are, but let's say it's 200 degrees Fahrenheit in the daytime and minus 200 degrees Fahrenheit at night. Something crazy like that is what happens when you don't have an atmosphere. Well, it cools off at night here in Kentucky, and we can still survive it. It's pretty cool. It wouldn't be that great if it got negative 200. We would die. And it's caused by our greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. So a little bit is a good thing. And so just like if you've ever been inside of a greenhouse, a big plastic coated building, it gets hot. And so just like that, gases in our atmosphere, CO2, methane, water vapor, and some other trace gases, they're clear, like the clear walls of a greenhouse. And so what they do is they let light come through. So light comes through those clear gases. It hits Earth. What happens when the light hits Earth, it slows it down a little bit. So it came through as high energy. Think about if you take a ball, a bouncy ball, and you throw it at a wall. Well, when it's going towards the wall, it's going really fast with a lot of energy. Then when it hits the wall, it's going to come back still pretty fast, but slower, right? Because some of the energy was absorbed when it hit the wall. So that's how these wavelengths of light happen. So they come through high energy, they hit stuff, trees, grass, car, ground, and they bounce back up in the atmosphere. When they bounce back up, they slowed down a little bit. There was some slowing down that happened here. That slowing down causes them to change the canteristics of them. Now, when it hits these greenhouse gases, it gets reflected back down to the Earth as heat. So now it can't escape into outer space. And this is natural and normal and good. But now, the problem is the natural greenhouse effect. We got this small layer of CO2 and some, nitrogen oxide, methane, and stuff. So we get a lot of sunshine coming in, a lot of heat re-radiated, so we don't freeze to death at night, but also a whole lot escapes. Now we look over here at the current world. We got the same amount of sunshine coming in, but then when it re-radiates, very little escapes into space. Most of it gets re-projected back down to Earth, making it hotter. And the same effect can be felt inside your car in the summertime. So, if anybody's ever opened their car in the summertime, it's hot in there because the windshield lets the light in, it gets trapped, and heat builds up inside the car, to the point that it could kill you, it could cook you. So on a hot, sunny day, your car is just like planet Earth under the greenhouse effect. But what's happening is we're increasing CO2 emissions from lots of sources. We're going to look at that. And because it's getting warmer, we're increasing water vapor in the form of evaporation and melting glaciers and ice caps. And then we're increasing methane production via human-caused things like landfills and cows. So this is making more and more greenhouse gases be in the atmosphere, causing global temperatures to rise. So the natural carbon cycle, what's going to happen here? And even, including factories and cars here. So what happens? We have atmospheric carbon dioxide, CO2. That's what, that's the major greenhouse gas that we're concerned about. Well, it's naturally in the air. We breathe it out. Deer breathe it out. Everything, it's what we exhale. Okay, so plants have this magic superpower. They can take sunshine and CO2 and combine that to make food for us and for them. It's pretty cool. Called photosynthesis. So this takes atmospheric CO2 and sucks it out of the air. Well, some of that CO2 gets released via cell respiration from those plants because they still do cell respiration just like us, even though they also do photosynthesis. And then some of them get eaten, right? Like we eat plants, deers eat plants, bugs, plants are the basis of pretty much all food chains on Earth. So it gets eaten, then respiration, breathing happens. So we release some back to the atmosphere. But then eventually this plant and this deer, they're going to die and they're going to rot. They're going to rot. And so these dead organisms, if they die in a location that has the right set of environmental conditions, which isn't everywhere, lots of places this is not the case, but if it's in the right kind of Goldilocks habitat, when they rot, they don't get released back into the air as CO2 very much. The carbon gets stored in the ground. And over geologic time, so thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years, that carbon that was in the ground gets converted into fossil fuels like coal, oil, and that kind of stuff, natural gas. So then it's trapped down here in the crust of the earth as fossil fuels. We dig it up, we burn it, we put it back in the atmosphere. The problem is currently we're doing step 5 way faster than step 3 can sequester it. So we're increasing atmospheric CO2 levels. If we look at the carbon footprint of people, the average global carbon footprint is 4 tons per year of CO2. It's kind of a lot, 4 tons, right? So if we look at that, but then the average North American generates 20 tons of CO2 per year. So it's like, whoa, 5 times more than everybody else. So we have a much higher carbon footprint than people in other parts of the world. And if we look at this graph here, this is the carbon footprint of people around the world. So we got everybody else in the world, India, Russia, us, and China. These are like the biggest countries, most populous. Okay, so if we're like, oh, China, yeah, they're emitting more carbon than we are. Those darn Chinese. Well, they have 4 times as many people in China as we do in the United States. So per person, they're still emitting a whole lot less than we do. We take up 5% of the world, our landmass in the United States is 5% of the world, yet we make 20% of the global carbon footprint. So we use more resources here in the US than anywhere else in the world. So if we look at, what this here shows, the typical person, what is the cause of their carbon footprint, right? So we look at, public services. This would be like buses and stuff like that. Gas, oil, and coal, we burn that for heat and stuff. Electricity, cars, private transport, public transport, holiday flights. 6% taking holiday flights. That's crazy. It takes a lot of jet fuel to fly a jet. And then we just look at these other things. Food and drink, 5%. Are you getting organic foods, which it's been shown that organic agriculture will actually sequester carbon in the soil, whereas conventional agriculture emits a lot of CO2. Recreating, this is just kind of a breakdown the average person where their carbon comes from. And this is for the U.S. as a whole. So we got 10% from agriculture, 10% from commercial and residential, like buildings, houses, that kind of stuff. Electricity, that's our big user. We use a lot of electricity. Transportation is another biggie, like your car, jets, stuff like that. Industry, this would be like factories and stuff. So this is, we produce a lot of CO2. The consequences of this are global climate change, global warming. And we don't use that term as much these days because parts of the world are not getting warmer, they're going to get colder. So we call it global climate change. But it's going to encompass the change in global average temperatures from the past to the present, and then we're going to predict into the future, and then we're going to live through the future. And global warming is our current trend that is caused by greenhouse gases. So if we look at since 1880, when we have good temperature data, up to now, we see that our current warming trend has been going on for at least the past 130 years, because that's kind of about as long back as we've kept good temperature records and that sort of thing. And at the same time, this is CO2 concentrations, this black line. These are warm, this is cold, this is warm, this is CO2. We see that CO2 concentrations has been increasing the whole time. And though we've had some cool years, right, like here in the 50s, 60s, here in the 70s, it's like, oh, it's going to be cold in the 70s. Still, on average, it's been getting warmer and warmer, right? We've been, like, these cool years weren't as cool as these years. See how the bars don't go as low. And then we get these spikes, like, oh, it was hot. And then, oh, cold off. But this is just weather, right? So climate-wise, we're still going up, getting hot years. And it's easy, again, to look at short-term data and make the wrong conclusion about something. But if we look at the overall long-term data, it is getting warmer and warmer. And if we look at atmospheric CO2, so yes, in the past, there have been massive volcanic eruptions causing greenhouse gas just to climb a bunch, right? So here, and you'll hear, climate change deniers say that, oh, CO2 cycles naturally. It's natural for it to go up and down. Yes, this is totally true. I 100% agree that it goes down, it goes up, it goes down, it goes up. Over geologic time for the past 500,000 years, this is what's happened. The difference being never in the last 650,000 years has CO2 increased above 330 parts per million. Well, now we're like, and it's even higher than that. It's higher than, it's like 409 now or something. Or even higher. So I made these slides a couple of years ago. And so it's hard to say, if we look at CO2 level increases from about the 1950s to now, we're shooting up. And this is post the Industrial Revolution. Since we've been burning fossil fuels, we have a massive increase in atmospheric CO2 levels. And how do we know this? How do we know what the atmospheric CO2 levels have been, right? Nobody was alive 650,000 years ago. Humans didn't even exist as a species that long ago. So how do we know? Well, we know from ice cores. So if we go to Antarctica and we start drilling down through the ice, we can look, because in the ice, there's little bubbles of the atmosphere that gets trapped and frozen in time. And each of these little bands is like a year. And if we drill deep enough, we can go back far enough. This is how we get atmospheric data from the past. So if we look at the past 130 years, we've had significant increases in these three gases, CO2, methane, water vapor. Well, the biggest cause is fossil fuel burning, right? So we take these ancient dead plants and animals and we burn them, and that releases CO2 as a waste product. Okay, so that's the biggest. Another big reason is deforestation. So if we look at Southeast Asia, so here's Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos, Myanmar, and Malaysia. In the 1970s, all this green was forest. Well, in 1990, look how much less forest there is. We've cut down most of the trees. And this is the same in like Brazil and Indonesia. We've got a lot of places they've cut down a lot of the trees really fast. And so since trees do photosynthesis, these forests absorb carbon dioxide via photosynthesis. And these are massive forests. And so without them, we have a lot less photosynthesis going on, a lot less carbon sequestration that way. So with fewer plants able to absorb CO2, there's more going to be in the atmosphere. And so then methane is a little different. So methane, a lot of it comes from cows. Cattle farming is a double whammy problem, because deforestation happens to put cows out. They cut down all the trees so they can have pasture for the cows. Okay, so it leads to land clearing, so we got less photosynthesis happening. But also cows burp and fart a lot, like a whole lot. And those burps and farts are methane. So they produce a very sizable amount of methane from the cows. So this is where methane comes from. Another source of methane is landfills. So when we take our garbage, especially things that could be composted, like organic matter, when we put it in a landfill, it rots. But when there's no oxygen there, the kind of bacteria that make it rot and the process that they go through when they don't have oxygen available, they produce methane gas. And we've got more landfills because we've got more people, we're making more trash, and so we got a lot of these landfills producing methane. And sometimes, and the technology exists, and we can totally always do it, but it's slightly more expensive. But we can put a plastic cap over these landfills and pipes in it and catch that methane. And then we can burn that as a fuel source for electricity. And there are some power plants around the US and other parts of the world that use these capped landfills as a source of methane to produce electricity, which is good, because we don't want that methane getting back into the atmosphere, because it's a whole lot worse than CO2. There's less of it in the atmosphere, so we don't hear about it as much or talk about it as much, but it's way more potent as a greenhouse gas than CO2 is. It does a lot more warming per molecule than CO2 does. So that's why we worry about methane. And water vapor is increased because temperatures are increased. All right, so we look at the water cycle. So the water cycle is the sun shines, solar energy comes down, heats up water, that water evaporates. As the water evaporates, it turns into clouds, and then when the clouds cool off, maybe because they go higher or whatever, when they cool off, it causes precipitation and they rain. And that rain then comes down, washes over land, or maybe it just rains back into the water, and it makes a circle, makes a cycle. So what's happening is we're getting more water vapor in the atmosphere because it's warmer, right? And hotter gases hotter air can hold more gas, and it holds more water. So we're seeing increased humidity around the world. And if we look since 1880, right, so 130 years, we've got temperature data. Since then, the warmest years out of all 130 have been in the last 20. The 10 hottest years on record have occurred in the last 20. And so that's strong evidence that it's getting warmer, right? And so these increased temperatures are also causing increased heat waves. Like I know in I believe it was 2013, I was out in Oklahoma. We had 63 days in a row that it was above 100 degrees Fahrenheit every single day. One day it was like 120. But it's just crazy hot. It's dangerously hot if you're outside. It can kill you. And in fact, a big heat wave in 2003 that hit Europe killed a lot of people because they're not used to, Europe's pretty far. If we look like France and England, they're up here with Canada, right? They're a little warmer typically because of the way the jet stream currents and stuff happen, but still, they don't get really super hot. But in 2003, it got really super hot, and people don't even have air conditioners there. It's not, the norm is that you don't have an air conditioner in your house, and so a lot of older people or people that were sick and had illness died, and it's estimated that 10 to 15. I think that the World Health Organization puts it like 14,700 or something people in France alone died in 2003 because of the heat. So that's pretty significant. Another evidence for this are melting glaciers. And sea ice, right? So Arctic sea ice in the summer has decreased 15% in the past 25 years. In the last 2 years, that's gone up even more. And since 1932, Glacier National Park has lost almost all of its glaciers. And it's estimated that in the next decade, Glacier National Park, our national park that was created because it had so many glaciers, will have no glaciers. They're all going to melt, and they are melting at dramatic rates. in the European Alps, glaciers have decreased, by 40% from their former range. So they're all melting. So this is all evidence for global warming. Arctic sea ice, we're seeing lots more of that melting, and in Antarctica, there's ice shelves that have never melted in human history, and for the last 300,000 years or whatever, and they're now melting. So we're seeing a lot more melting, a lot warmer, and this is our increase in temperature here. So we're seeing everything that's kind of pinkish blue and red is a bigger increase. So we're going to see more increase at the northern latitudes. So the polar ice caps are probably not going to be there. Another thing is sea levels are rising. We've seen sea levels rise. We were documenting, we're living it currently. Sea levels are rising. Since 1938, a third of the coastal marshes in Chesapeake Bay have been submerged by rising sea levels. So that's, it's coming up. And sea levels in Florida are expected to rise by at least 1 meter by the end of the century, and by up to 3 meters, which is 9 feet, by the next 200 years. So in the next 2 centuries, it's going to raise 9 feet. And so these maps here, everything in red is going to flood. Look at Miami. Miami's a pretty big city, right? Tampa, big city. They're going to be underwater. 3-foot rise in the next 100 years. 9-foot rise in the next 200 years. So this is a pretty big deal. We're seeing sea levels rise already as we speak. Another thing that's happening, flowers are coming out earlier. And you get like spring wildflowers. If you live in Kentucky and you walk around in the woods, you'll know that in the spring there's a lot of flowers. And even if you plant them, like daffodils and tulips and stuff like that, a lot of these things are blooming and coming up above ground earlier than they did several decades ago. And so this is causing people to have to change the way they plant and grow things. And also, it's causing a lot of the plants are dying because they're coming up because it's warmer, and they think, oh, it's springtime, but the northern hemisphere is still pointed so far away from the sun that they don't get enough sunlight to grow. So they use their energy reserves to push up out of the soil, and there's not enough sun there to recoup that, and so then they end up dying from that. Another thing that can kill them is they're coming up several weeks earlier than they used to, so there could still be hard frosts that could happen. So these occasional killing frosts can occur and wipe them out. So we're seeing this happen a lot. In England, a third of the birds are nesting earlier than they used to. This bird watching is a popular thing there, and people watch when they nest and when they migrate back. And so many of them are laying eggs much earlier than they used to. And the problem with this is maybe the bugs haven't caught up and the seeds haven't caught up, and so there's not going to be enough food for them to feed their young. So the young may die because of that. And maybe it'll frost. Maybe we're still so early in the year, because it's warmer, but it's still early, so there could still be frost that will kill the young. So that can happen. We're seeing shifts in species ranges. Things that used to require, that still require a warmer temperature, they can move now. Maybe they were restricted to tropical areas before, but now they can move northward and that kind of thing. And so we're seeing that with this fungus called the chytrid fungus in frogs and salamanders, but in amphibians. And so this chytrid fungus is killing many, many amphibians because historically it couldn't grow in these cooler areas where it's currently at. And so the species of frogs that live there have no immunity to it. So when it comes in, it just wipes them all out. And it used to be restricted to warmer places where the frogs had co-evolved with it and they had immunity to it and it didn't kill them. But now that the chytrids are able to move because of global warming, it's killing off many, many frogs. In fact, some species have gone extinct from this fungus. And in Europe, many of the butterflies are being found farther north than they used to be. So they're moving north. We're seeing population declines in many, many species. Besides just the frogs that are getting killed by the chytrids, we're seeing polar bears, their numbers are dwindling. Many penguin species, their numbers are decreasing. and lots of other cold habitat animals like the Arctic fox and seals and walruses and those sorts of things are declining due to habitat loss from global warming. If you require a bunch of ice and all the ice melts, well, now you're not going to make it. So why? We've got tremendous amounts of evidence and data and facts to back this up and to show that humans are creating more CO2 and methane, which is causing the Earth to get warmer as a whole. So why in the U.S. is it controversial? Like, why do you think, why is it still even debated? Like, someone says, I don't believe in climate change. It's kind of like saying, I don't believe the sky's blue. Okay, you can maybe not believe that. It doesn't change the fact that it's real. And so in the U.S., we have this crazy thing going on. It's controversial, right? Well, part of it is because we have industrial special interest groups. If you have a whole lot of money and your livelihood is tied to doing something that increases, carbon dioxide emissions or global warming, well, you're going to fight it, right? Just like, back in the 70s and 80s, tobacco companies, fought to say, smoking is good for you, and that everyone used to smoke, and so there was a lot of lobbying by special interest groups then to deny smoking caused cancer and all that. But now we know conclusively, yeah, smoking causes lung cancer and other problems like heart attacks and things. And so it's kind of the same thing going on now. Is interest groups that have a lot of money try to put out things to undermine the scientific community and change the way they feel. And they take small, there's no consensus. So we don't know exactly how much warmer it's going to get, when and where, but there is consensus. Everybody says, yeah, it's going to get warmer by quite a bit. There's some differences, and the computer models are flawed. Well, they're still all saying it's going to get warmer, so it's going to happen. We could have biased media and politicians, right? So media and politicians, neither are scientific. Currently, in this last election, there were a few scientists who ran for public office, like Senate seats and House representative seats and stuff. But I don't know, the ones I followed didn't win, so I'm not sure about others, but there's not very many scientists in public office. So we can say generally politicians are not scientific. They're going to have law degrees or marketing degrees and political science degrees. They're not scientists. And so the media and politicians are both biased for their base. Like a politician, they're just wanting to get reelected. That's the goal of all politicians, is to get reelected. And media, their goal is to sell you stuff. To sell you TV time, to sell you newspapers, to sell you magazines. So they're going to be siding with their viewers so that they continue to get good ratings and that sort of thing. And so here's a video that I can't show within this lecture, but if you click on this YouTube link and you go to it and watch it, it's a video of Senator Jim Inhofe from Oklahoma holding a snowball saying climate change isn't real. But again, he's using weather to make inferences about climate, and that's wrong. That's not the way we do it, and you all know that now. Another thing is the public, they mistrust or misunderstand science. Maybe math and science were hard subjects in school, and so you just hate them, and you don't trust scientists. And a lot of the public don't understand enough about science to make good decisions, or they mistrust them altogether and follow their own preconceived ideas. So sometimes climate change is viewed as a scam, right? And so here's a John Oliver video, kind of making a mockery of this, but showing that. So you can watch this video and see how the mistrust of science goes. And so many of us also live a luxurious life here in North America, right? We have a house, we have electricity, we have a car, we have all these things, and in order to curb our carbon emissions, we're going to have to maybe, not drive a 6.0 liter V8 engine that consumes a lot of gas. Maybe we're not going to have to drive a 1.3 liter tiny little car with no horsepower kind of thing to get by, and people don't like that. Anytime you want somebody to downgrade their lifestyle, they're going to get kind of ticked off usually. And so the difference in this controversy of special interest groups, the media, and the public misunderstanding is that they're biased and they're not based on fact. So science and the process of science is unbiased in their findings, right? In fact, research papers undergo, when scientists publish a research paper, they undergo extensive review by other scientists that are their competition. And they're like, so if I try to publish a paper, my colleagues, my peers working at other universities, other places that are my competition, are going to read it. And they're going to try to tear it apart and be like, no, you're wrong because of X, Y, or Z. So every published scientific article goes through this process, so that, if your technique was bad or your data were, wrong somehow, they're going to call you out on it, and you're going to not get to publish that research. But since all this, massive amounts of data have been published showing that global warming's happening, it's being caused by us by emitting more CO2 and methane, science is showing that. When science makes a conclusion like that, it draws that from evidence, not from finding evidence with a predetermined conclusion, but you find all the facts, you put them together, and then you make the conclusions. So science is objective, unlike these things. And so it's just a lot of issues, it's a lot of social issues and that kind of thing, why people think the way they do and act the way they do. But the fact of the matter still is climate change is happening, and there's proof. So since it's happening and there's proof, whether or not some people, quote, believe it or not, how's it going to affect you? What's happening, right? And so this is going to radically affect biological communities. And though global warming and cooling can be natural and are natural, and in the history of life on Earth it's happened naturally, it's usually really slow. So species have time to adapt. Our human-caused global warming currently is being accelerated, and so it's really fast. And so remember that natural extinction, usually a species gets replaced by a new species. Evolution, so it evolves into something new. But in this current human-caused extinction, species they don't have time to evolve. They're just going away. Okay, so we're seeing this massive unnecessary extinction of much of the world's biodiversity. So we're seeing that happen. We're going to see increased desertification. It's only going to get worse in dry areas as temperatures increase. The rates of evaporation are going to increase, and it's going to leave little to no groundwater available for irrigation. So in the Midwestern U.S., like Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, over into Colorado and up through the Dakotas and that area there, most agriculture is done with irrigation. And that irrigation comes out of groundwater for the most part. And I know in like southwestern Kansas, northwestern Oklahoma, southeastern Colorado, like in that area, there's this big aquifer called the Ogallala Aquifer. And it's ancient water. It's been there for many hundreds of thousands of years. And people have been sucking water out of it since they figured out how to put a hole in the ground and put a pipe in it. Well, in the last 100 years, the depth of water has decreased by over 200 feet. So they've had to drill wells over 200 feet deeper to get to the water. And the water's not infinite. The geologists have figured out how many gallons of water are stored in this aquifer underground, and it's going to run out. I mean, it is running out. Some farms have ceased to exist because they ran out of water. So that's happening. So we're seeing this increased desertification, and it's going to be lower crop yields and more poverty. Like in the Midwest, we're going to see decreased crop yields because there's no water. We're running out of water there, which might be hard to believe living in Kentucky, because it's kind of like a rainforest here. And in fact, most climate models are showing that the southeast Appalachian mountain area, it's going to become a rainforest almost. It's going to get really wet. It's wet here, but out west, not so much. It's getting drier around desert areas. Okay. In coastal areas, we're going to see increased flooding because sea levels are going to rise, so it's going to increase flooding. Like the Houston hurricane, flooded everything out. We're going to be seeing more of that. As part of that, we're going to see more frequent and intense storms, costing lives and money. I don't have the numbers on hand, but in the last 5 years, we've seen more Category 5 hurricanes than we had in something like the last 50 years. I need to look those numbers up again, but something crazy like that. And we're seeing tornadoes, like the Tornado Alley you may have heard of, being central Oklahoma, central Kansas, that kind of thing. It's shifting east, so we're getting more tornadoes, in Missouri and Arkansas, and in the southeastern U.S. than we used to see. So we're getting these more intense weather patterns, and if you live in an area, say like Oklahoma, the tornadoes are just normal, and the locals, sit on the porch and drink beer and watch them because it's just what happens all the time. You're prepared for it. You've got a cellar or something to, a shelter to go into. But if you're in a place like Kentucky where tornadoes rarely happen, you might not be prepared for it. So we're going to experience these much more intense weather. When it rains, it's going to be a lot more rain. Thunderstorms are going to be worse. And all this is because storm strength is correlated to atmospheric temperature. How much temperature is a form of energy, right? Heat. So how much energy is in the atmosphere controls how strong the storms are. So we're seeing hurricanes being more frequent and stronger. What used to maybe would just be a tropical storm or a big bad thunderstorm, now it's a hurricane wiping out cities. The same goes with the tornadoes. They're getting bigger, right? And so we see that. And so this is going to cause, in developing countries, more poverty. There's already a lot of poverty there, but right, if you're living in low-lying areas, you're flooding, your crops are dying, they don't have enough natural resources to sustain them, and they're not making any money because if we're a fisherman and all the fish are dead or washed away, or your crops that we were relying on for your annual income flooded, you'll have no money, and so this will cause more refugees because you're going to try to leave and go somewhere better. Because they don't have the resources to survive. Like a lot of these countries, they don't have FEMA. Houston floods, gets wiped out. Hurricane Katrina wiped out New Orleans. We have this big government agency to help people rebuild and come back from that. But in a lot of these communities in other countries, that don't exist. So when you get wiped out, you just have to leave. And so the big lesson here is, though reducing greenhouse gas emissions by burning less fossil fuels is going to help, we can't forget that habitat destruction is still going to be a big threat, and that if we could prevent this, habitat destruction will help curb some of the effects of climate change. So climate change is going to cause economic losses, and this is you can appeal to people's emotions, and sometimes that works, but really appealing to their pocketbook is the better way. So we're going to increase property insurance premiums, because if I'm your insurance agent and I'm like, well, probably going to have a tornado wipe your house out now, I'm going to charge more money for that. You're going to have more costs in home repairs and that kind of thing. So you got higher, because you got to fix it because a tornado, hurricane wiped it out. You got to rebuild it. So that's going to cost money. Your insurance is going to go up because you had a claim against it. So it's going to cost a lot more money that way. I'm going to see more health problems. We're seeing a lot of diseases that we used to think of, that's only in the tropics and it's only in Africa or whatever, right? So like Zika and malaria, these kind of things are spreading. Their range is spreading because it's getting warmer, and the mosquitoes that carry them, that live in warm places, can live in other places now because it's warmer there. So we're getting those spread, and we're having new species that can carry them. New mosquitoes are carrying malaria that didn't used to, because they'd never been exposed to it before. They'd never gotten the chance to carry it, but now they are, and that's making it leapfrog even more. We're going to see more like heat strokes, for people working out in the heat, that kind of thing. We're gonna have to move infrastructure. Like if you ever been to the beach, you'll see there's hotels and houses and crap galore right up on the ocean. Well, when sea levels rise, we're gonna have to move that because it is gonna be underwater. So we're gonna have to move roads and move buildings, and it's gonna cost billions of dollars for this movement to happen, right? And food costs are gonna increase. We're gonna see higher food costs because there's gonna be less water, more harmful weather to crops and livestock. These big severe weather events are going to damage crops. And we got a little taste of this a couple of years ago because about 90% of our vegetables in North America here are grown, or in the United States at least, not counting Mexico, but in the U.S. are grown in California. And they experienced a really bad drought a couple of years ago, and food prices went up. And so that's only going to continue with climate change. So what do we need to do? Well, we're going to have to increase our renewable energy. Solar, wind, geothermal, hydro. We got to increase renewable energy so that we become carbon neutral. Otherwise, we're just going to keep making the world warmer. The more fossil fuels we burn, the warmer the world's going to get. So we got to increase fuel standards, get better miles per gallon in the U.S. And so it has increased some in the last decade. But after the oil embargo in the 80s, they made cars that got over 30 miles per gallon. Now they don't have they're not real sexy. They don't have a lot of horsepower, but they're really fuel efficient. And so then, good times came in the 90s. People had plenty of money. We had plenty of oil. So we're like, whatever, let's make giant engines again. And so miles per gallon decreased in cars for quite some time. And now it's starting to increase again. There were some initiatives put in the last decade to increase the average miles per gallon in cars, and so it has increased some, but we need to increase it more. We need to eat less meat, right? If cows produce tremendous amounts of methane, and it takes a whole lot of land to raise a cow, we need to eat less meat, even if it was as little as, I'm not saying everybody needs to be vegan and but if Americans eat on average meat every day. And so if you would just take one day a week and not eat meat, it would be a huge savings in methane emissions because there would be less cows. And there needs to be more education. The public doesn't understand that this is a real thing and what to do about it and what the consequences are going to be. So we need more initiatives to educate people. Reduce our natural resource usage, be more efficient with them. I look at like just around me locally, there could be a logging operation go on, and they cut down all the trees, and they just cut the big high-dollar log out of the trunk and leave the whole rest of the tree laying there. Well, that could be made into paper, could be made into wood chips for mulch on playgrounds and all kinds of stuff. Could be made into cellulosic insulation for houses. There's just like a tremendous amount of stuff that we could use all this extra wood that we're just letting lay out there in the woods and rot. And somewhere else, we're cutting down trees to make those things. And so having a more efficient usage of our natural resources needs to happen, both by consuming less. We need to use less materials in general. That's a big thing with Americans. We're really big on the use it once, throw it away thing. We need to have more reusable things. But with the things we do use, we need to become more efficient. Just like, for instance, CFL light bulbs decreased electricity usage by 90% over the old incandescent bulbs. And you can put a low flow shower head on your shower, and it cuts the water use in half. You won't notice a difference showering. In fact, it'll give you more water pressure, but it'll decrease your usage of water. And so these are just things that we can do to decrease our use on natural resources. As an everyday person, if everyone did it, it would make a massive difference. And so we also need to support public policy that curbs these effects, right? So the way that this is going to change is through laws and regulations and policy. And so by voting, you should vote. And if you vote for people who are going to help this help change this, it could help curb the effects of climate change. And so it's real. There is no climate, like whether or not climate change is real, that's not a debate. Now, it is politically currently, which is just stupid. Um, what the political debate needs to be is, yeah, this freaking thing's happening. What are we going to do about it? How do we fix it? How do we slow it down? Now that's a great political conversation that needs to happen with our parties and political figures, not whether or not it's real and whether or not people are causing it. That's not debatable. That the evidence is there. That's fact. But how do we fix it? That needs to happen. We really need to be having that public debate with our politicians, and you should vote for whoever you think is going to fix it the best. Right? And so it's not that climate change isn't natural. It is. Climate change has always happened. Climates change. It's just that we are causing it to occur so fast that it's difficult for life on Earth to adapt to it. And that includes us, our species. It's difficult to adapt. All right. So next chapter, what's up next week is going to be the extinction processes, and we're going to look at how do things go extinct. What's that mean? So we looked this week at mass extinctions and climate change. Next week is extinction processes. And so make sure that you look at the quiz over chapter 6 and do that on Blackboard there.